of mine, and old, yes, David Nordlander, who a long while ago wrote his PhD dissertation on the Soviet Gulag, did an excellent dissertation, published articles on the basis of it. Then he moved into other areas, worked for quite a while for the U.S. Library of Congress, and worked also for various consulting organizations. He is now an independent historian and consultant, and is, I believe, living on Cape Cod. So I'm glad to have him back here. He was at one point a visiting scholar here at what was then the Russian Research Center, I think. It may
Just
have
transitioning.
It's just been renamed the Davis Center. So I'm very pleased to welcome him back here. I think it's his first time back, if I'm not mistaken. But maybe there was a conference we had here that he took part in. But in any case, I very much welcome the topic he is addressing here today. I have in the past looked into this myself, looking both at Soviet documents, especially in the former Ukrainian KGB archive, which went from 2015 until February 2022, was wide open and was excellent working conditions, extremely well led by the staff there, and Andrei Kahut in particular, the director. They are still working now, but the reading room is not accessible because of the war, but it will be again after the war ends. I hope with a much better settlement than the United States seems to be pushing for at present. But in any case, there are also large collections of CIA materials, many of which are posted online, but there are also others at the National Archives. David is drawing, when he wrote his dissertation, he was based in Magadan, way out in the Far East, extremely cold climate. And he did, however, find there an archive that yielded some valuable material. So I think he's drawing, I'm not sure, but I think today he'll be drawing in part on some materials he found there as well. So with that, let me turn to Dave.
Thank you. Nice to be back. I was actually a postdoctoral fellow here at the Davis Center 20-some years ago, and got to know Mark well because of Cold War studies and other topics, other events that we had here. And so this is a wonderful place, of course, and always fun to come back. As Mark said, after I was here as a fellow, I went to work for the Library of Congress, which at the time was headed by a historian of Russia, James Billington, and he had just all sorts of Russian projects. And we were scanning collections at the Library of Congress up in Alaska, across Siberia, the big libraries in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And we had a mobile scanning unit going around Siberia to scan amazing collections that I was the manager of. And that was fascinating, including the Museum of the Permafrost, which is up near Salahard. So, and as Mark said, I lived in Magadan and wrote my dissertation on the history of Dalstroy, which was the camp administration in the Magadan region, which was the single largest unit of the Gulag from the late 20s into the mid 50s. And that was, you know, they had never opened, I was there in the mid to late 90s a few times. They'd never opened archives before then. And it was an amazing scholarly experience, what I was able to get into. And I started with 3 months in Moscow, and I worked in the Central Party Archive, the State Archive of the Russian Federation, and did a lot of work in the Stalin library and records in that. And then I went and looked at a lot of the Gulag chiefs in Magadan and their correspondence with into Moscow and various other records. So it was just a great topic and really interesting. As Mark said too, I work with Dartmouth and Smithsonian after the Library of Congress, and we're scanning a lot of collections still, not so much from Russia since the Ukraine crisis, but still on Russian-related topics in U.S. repositories, rare book libraries, and we're trying to put together really an integrated Arctic digital library from various sources, including Russia, and hopefully we can work again with Russia, but it hasn't been the case recently, of course. But as Mark said, my scholarly interest still remains. I've published quite a bit from my work in the Magadan archives, and that remains my intellectual focus aside from these web projects. But I got interested in this topic of CIA covert operations in Soviet Ukraine and wrote Mark about an interest to talk about it because it was a tangential topic that came up from my work in the Magadan archives. And I want to talk a little bit about this and how I got into the topic. Later in the talk, I'll talk, specifically about the CIA operations themselves. And just as an entree into that, I'll be focusing on what was known as Operation Red Sox in the late 1940s, early 1950s. And it was related to, and Mark, I'm a Gulag specialist. Mark has so much experience in, Cold War studies. So in our conversation or question period, Mark, I'm sure can add a lot more insights into the CIA and covert operations, which is not my specialty. But anyway, Operation Red Sox seemed to be linked to Operation Redbird, which was also an effort to have covert operations, it seemed, in the Baltic states. And I'll talk a little bit about how they kind of linked or overlapped. But initial planning began after the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, kind of transformed into what became known as the Strategic Services Unit, or SSU, after World War II. And as early as 1946, there were the head of the SSU at that time was Colonel William Quinn, and they were having conversations and discussions about how could they tap, especially the large volume of displaced persons who had come from Eastern Europe, the Soviet republics, into Germany and other areas. I think the total was 2.3 million displaced persons. And there was a Munich operations base where the SSU had some officers working from there, but they realized that they had this mass of raw potential assets that they could work with to try to get some basic intelligence about the Soviet Union, the emerging East Bloc, what became known as the captive nations after World War II. And this was a priority. The problem is at that time, the US, if you really look at before World War II, the US was a much smaller country with a much smaller global footprint. And so even in 1946, there was just really major glaring lacuna in US knowledge of the Eastern Bloc or the Soviet Union. It was extremely thin. And so there was a lot, you can tell in the early meetings, there was a lot of back and forth about how can we get intelligence, basic intelligence from these regions, and the displaced persons camps could probably be a great possibility to find, some people from the various countries who could assist in that process. Now, eventually, Operation Red Sox turned in by 1949. The first part of it began in September of 1949, and it was to drop emigres back in Ukraine by parachute. And the tragedy of it was that I think it was heavily compromised by Soviet counterintelligence, and most of the agents dropped back by parachute were captured very quickly. I think over 75%. And ultimately, I've been working on a lot of CIA history. CIA.gov has a lot of great materials on this. They considered it a failure, an early failure in CIA operations, a learning experience, but clearly a failure. I think what it came out of when you look at the history of World War II and especially the OSS, the idea came out of Operation Jedburgh, which was had been largely successful to drop, I think it was French, Dutch, Belgian nationals behind German lines after the invasion of Normandy in order to assist the Allied cause and move into further east in Germany. And most historians I consulted on this said that Operation Jedburgh was quite successful, and very helpful in the furtherance of Allied, war plans toward the end of World War II, 44 and 45. I think whatever success OSS had in that did not translate, as I said, to the CIA operations in Ukraine. I think there was, in a sense, that Operation Jedburgh kind of laid a possible effective plan that just didn't work out for a variety of reasons that I'll talk about. And I'll also talk, what's interesting is if you look at CAA or SSU, CAA is formed in 1947. If you look at internal debates, they go back and forth about the value of intelligence, several officers, especially in the SSU, they did not really trust the use of these displaced persons as effective agents or intelligence gathering. Others considered it better possibilities, but there was a real split among early officials about the usefulness of trying to tap these displaced persons. A lot changed when President Truman promulgated the Truman Doctrine in 1947, and then Kennan wrote his famous long telegram and sources of Soviet conduct. By 47, 48, you read the sources and it looks like there had been a real revolution, not only in what the Soviet threat was, and the fact that a lot of officers, were thinking that we might be on the verge of World War III or a real military conflict with the Soviet Union. Things started to change, and the agency kind of picked up on the earlier discussions, and by 49 launched Operation Red Sox, and I'll talk a bit about that. I just wanted to go back to the Gulag to explain kind of where I came to this topic. And as Mark said, in the mid to late 90s, when you worked in a place like Magadan, where there was an economic crisis, hyperinflation, I still remember it was very windy in Magadan. And I remember I don't know if I had what was it, a 10,000 ruble note and I had the equivalent of maybe $25, $30, but I was going to the grocery store there and the wind took it. And I ran down the street trying to catch this paper money that was kind of symbolic of the stresses of it. But Magadan was, in that era, there was, aside from hyperinflation, there was, a heating crisis, hot water and heating on 3 days, off 3 days. And in Magadan, when everything went off, it was like 60 below. And if you went in the interior of the Kolyma region, it was, up into Yakutsk, it was 70 or 80 below. So Magadan was slightly moderated by the Sea of Okhotsk, part of the Pacific Ocean. But the conditions were grim, and the archives, you would have a single light, really cold. I had to wear fingerless gloves because the walls were windbreaks. And I worked a lot in the state archive of the Magadan region and the NKVD archive. And in the NKVD archive, I was in a prison cell with bars and everything. And they would serve the papers that I wanted, the Lichne Diala of the prisoners, into this prison cell. And it was strange, but the materials were rich. But what as I was going through my own work, which was to really
point to add here, David also lived in a dormitory there in which there was no heating most of the week, and so he would have to, at night, just to keep warm, he would have to wear 3 or 4 coats and with blankets and everything. So
well, and not only that, the only thing that worked, that little Russian kitchen, which actually had an apartment for a time, and when the heat went off, you could turn the stove on, the oven, and sit in the kitchen and try to stay warm. But then you had to go to bed, which was, and I still remember when the hot water came on, you would take a shower, and it was so hard to turn the water off. It's just instantly like icicles. So, but then they had things like, you could buy king crab because it's on the Pacific Ocean in Magadan. You could buy it for the equivalent of $2 for a whole king crab, which would be like $20 a pound here. So I'd sometimes have this strange experience of eating king crab while freezing and afraid to take a shower because of getting out of the shower. So, but I used fingerless gloves, and I have to say, at least back then, I was kind of an oddity or an anomaly in Magadan. There were no foreigners. I have to say, as the people who, the officials in the archives were really kind. I couldn't complain. And sometimes they would want to have tea and cake before you start your day. And it was always a good idea, of course, but it was a pleasant experience. To get into the NKVD archive, I had an official удостоверение from Moscow to study there, but I got there and this KGB or FSB agent, he had a uniform and he was not happy with this certificate I had gotten in Moscow. And he said, I don't care what they say, I allow you to get in. And we shared a bottle of vodka, and I'm not a drinker, but I knew that was entree. And he loosened up. And that archive, of course, was a crux because it had all the lichnia diela or prisoner files of floor to ceiling files from about 2 million plus prisoners that had been in the Magadan camp. So it was fascinating, although grueling. But to go back to the topic, I got interested in this topic because I learned the ethnic composition of a lot of the prisoners, and you could just see waves. If you could track almost Soviet history through the waves of ethnic composition of the prison population. Just was like there was a lag time, to get them out to Magadan, but and I noticed by the late 40s this influx of these Ukrainian nationalists, as it was described in the prisoner files, and large amounts. And then by the early 50s, it was tapering, so you could kind of see the tapering off of the Ukrainian insurgent army or the people arrested as that died down as Stalin, I guess you could say, essentially crushed it ultimately. But those ethnic composition files, which you could find in the archives, were fascinating. And I got really interested in the Ukrainian topic, what was happening in Ukraine in the post-war period and with the Ukrainian underground movement, the insurgent army, et cetera. And I just to talk a little bit about the archives there. So in Magadan, the state archives of the Magadan region have the Dalstroy files. Dalstroy was what translates as Far Northern Construction Trust. And that was the official management of the gold extraction, other mineral extraction in a region that went from the Lena River to the Bering Strait and down to right of the northern part of Kamchatka. So today Magadan Oblast is maybe a quarter of that, but at the time Dalstroy, it was a major empire, so to speak, larger than the country of France. So most of the prison camps were in the Kalama region, the river where a lot of placer gold deposits were located. So that was the heart of the region, but it extended into Zukotka, northern Kamchatka, and although gold was the primary extractive industry there, silver, molybdenum, tin, there were other metals and minerals that were of interest to the Soviet authorities. So I did a lot of work in the Dalstroy files to understand the gold mining operations and the economic output. They had great statistics on mineral production by year in the Dalstroy files. The oddity was that if you just look through the Dalstroy files, there was a pretense that this was a civilian, in Soviet terms, civilian quote unquote operation. And there was an effort to hide aspects of the Gulag even in Magadan. And that was kind of a disconnect because I didn't know who they were hiding it from. But when you went through the archives, the Dalstroy files were very much focused on management and economic production. Now you could go over to what was called the Sevislog records. Sevislog was the northeastern camps, essentially providing the labor to Dalstroy, which was all prison labor. And Now that was what was revealing. You know, Dalstroy, I mean, Magadan it was a strange but classic Soviet town in that there were quote unquote dobrovolny workers in Dalstroy, people who, you know, took a job and moved there, but they had not been prisoners. But even in the Dalstroy hierarchy, accountants, economic analysts, and all, many were prisoners themselves. So this overlap between what you could find in these Seveslog records went into the bureaucracy of Dalstroy itself. And tragically, you know, waves of, especially in the Great Purges, the Dalstroy bosses and administrators fell into the prisoner category ultimately. There were very few people who went through Magadan that didn't ultimately, one way or another, wind up in the camps. And that was, you know, but what I'm trying to say is they were not, you know, initially when they went there, they were civilian workers, quote unquote. But again, that's where if you went through not the Dalstroy archives, but the Seveslog archives, you could see this. So that was focused on economic and gold production primarily. The Northeastern Camp Archives was focused on the labor population, and that's where you could see these records of ethnic composition by year. So after 1940, just you could see these waves of Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians coming in where you didn't see it that much in the 30s. By the late 40s, many more Ukrainians coming in. And that, you know, piqued my interest about, you know, of course, what was happening and why this was being reflected in the prisoner population. And then finally, the NKVD archives was largely these Lichnia Dela, the specific prisoner files for everyone. And that was interesting because, you know, I was writing about the entire, you know, 1929 to 41, the first part of Dalstroy history. And among the 2 million plus prisoner files, you know, I did a sampling, but then I also looked at, you know, Sergei Korolev had been a prisoner, the rocket designer, had been a prisoner in the Magadan region. Of course, Eugenia Ginsburg. And I went carefully through an Osip Mandelstam, although he never made it to Magadan, he made it to the Vladivostok transit camp and died there. He was officially in the Dalstroy system, even in Vladivostok. And I went through those, you know, the Lichnia Dela because they were very specific about the charges, the statement of the prisoner, which was really interesting, reacting to some of the charges brought against them. So the files had a lot of autobiographical information. Just as a really quick aside, because it's kind of human interest, one of the reasons I went to Magadan because I just loved Krutoy Marshrut by Eugenia Ginsburg. I thought it was one of the great literature from the Gulag. And when I got her prisoner file, she famously, of course, she contested the charges. They were fantastical, bogus, and you know, not accurate. But she also commented how, you know, she'd been a teacher, aside from a party member, and the NKVD agents in interviewing her in Magadan were semi-literate. So she noticed that they were typing up parts of her interview and making spelling mistakes that she corrected. And when I went through her prisoner file, I found the spelling mistakes, which was just strange. I don't know, from having read Krutoy Marshrut, it was interesting. But it also showed me how just, you know, anybody who had an Article 58 charge, there's just so much bogus charges that were untrue. She tried to contest it without much success. And the fantastical charges that you could see levied against prisoners in these prisoner files were, it just was an epitome of you know, no one was really guilty, so everyone, or what's the saying, Mark? No one in the Soviet Union was guilty, and so everyone is susceptible to whatever charges. I also went through Sergei Korolev's case file, and I'll tell you more how this relates to the topic. Korolev was arrested, I think, in 1937 or 38. and went to Magadan for about a year and a half. And he just, in spite of his, brilliance, he was put in the general prison population in gold mining, and suffered severe health effects, lost most of his teeth. Somehow, somebody in Moscow realized, I think before World War II, that he should be in a sharashka. He was taken then out of Magadan and placed in a sharashka for scientific research before and through much of World War II. But Korolov's file was fascinating because he was accused by the NKVD of trying to purposefully sabotage rocket designs and rocket experimentation. And Korolov was, his response in the files was remarkable, because he contested it, and he said, these people have no technical knowledge. They're charging me with, sabotaging rockets on launch, but there's no physics behind what they're charging. You can't make a rocket act that way. And he went all through this, and quite brave in a way, but he lampooned the investigators and just said, these are ridiculous charges. I'm not sure that's what got him out of Magadan, but it just showed how some of these prisoners did react to what were clearly just bogus and fantastical charges. The reason I say that partly is when you start going through the Ukrainian case files, they were, charged with contacts with foreign intelligence services, association with the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists and the Ukrainian Insurgent Army. It's the Gulag, the Lichny Dela were not great to rely on for any kind of objective information, because there were just so many really unmoored political charges, especially for the Article 58ers, that you just couldn't get a lot out of that. But I did realize as these waves of Ukrainian prisoners came in that these charges were being made, that of course there were, well, as I went through the CIA archives, there were contacts, there were efforts to, undermine, gather intelligence on the East Bloc and undermine Soviet power in various republics. But they didn't really add up to the numbers of people that were coming into Magadan and being charged with. I think Operation Red Sox ultimately may have parachuted, was it 85 to 90 people in, of which most of them were caught. If you start looking in the Gulag archives, there's a lot more people being charged with this kind of activity that couldn't possibly, the numbers never add up. But that's you had to weigh what was going on with just the bogus nature of these political charges in the Soviet Union with the actual events. But as I said, if you went through the Sevaslog, forget what the title was, but it was there were records on the ethnic composition of the prison population. And by the late 1940s, you just see a real wave of Ukrainian prisoners coming in. And that's where I got fascinated to try to go back and look at CIA archives and records to see what was happening, reading about the Ukrainian insurgent army and the uprising, how the events, say, between 1946 to 53 overlapped with the prison population and the numbers of Ukrainians coming into the camps. Anyway, let me go back to the SSU and some aspects of what became Operation Red Sox. As I said, Munich, the Munich operations base was kind of a center point for coordinating, I think, between the US Army, State Department, SSU. There was an official there named Boleslav Holtzman who worked for SSU counterintelligence. And Holtzman became kind of the point person to correlate some early reports that were being written for the SSU with the situation of the displaced persons within various camps in Germany, and the possibility of using them as intelligence assets going forward. As I said earlier, what's kind of interesting is, well, the leader of the SSU was a man named Colonel William Quinn. And as I pointed to earlier, he kind of, if you look through his time as the head of it, he kind of epitomized the ambivalence of the Strategic Services Unit to tap these Ukrainian emigres as potential intelligence assets. That changed by 1949, but in 1946, there was a real debate going on among the officials in SSU, and as well as with State Department and the U.S. Army. The two issues that Quinn brings out when you look through the CIA archival materials was a real fear that there was a lot of ignorance among American officials, as I said, to what really was the situation in Eastern Europe and the Soviet republics. There was a fear that they did not understand the goals and motivations of a lot of the Ukrainian emigres, and that the US could be quickly ensnared in something that they just didn't have a lot of knowledge about. And Quinn, in his reports, talked about Ukrainian emigres too often seeming as adroit political intriguers, and I'm quoting here, and past masters in the art of propaganda. There was a fear that the displaced persons, would have their own, of course, they have their own goals and objectives that wouldn't mesh with Strategic Services Unit. And that was, that became a bigger problem. And maybe, we can talk about this afterward. There was an official named Miron Matvienko who had was in the Ukrainian Supreme Liberation Council and had worked in the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, and he eventually turned out to be a double agent and defected to the Soviet Union in 1951, I think. And a lot of the early Strategic Services Unit officials were very worried about that. They didn't have a feel for how much these contacts could be compromised by Soviet counterintelligence. There was fear that there was a separate agenda that wouldn't mesh with U.S. goals. And so you can just see as you go through the files that there's no consensus among American officials in 1946 and early 47 that they're going to go forward with this kind of intelligence gathering using the displaced persons, in this case from Ukraine. There also, Quinn, at another point of his reports, had said that there was real concern that if the Strategic Services Unit got heavily involved with these emigres, that they might further inflame the struggle between the Wehrmacht and Red Army that had awakened ancient rivalries and hatreds in Ukraine. And Quinn just said that, like you could see that there was a lot of concern about how to approach someone like Stepan Bandera, because the Poles hated Bandera. The Bandera was kind of an epitome of the Ukrainian nationalists that had allied with the Wehrmacht as it came into Ukraine. And there was a fear that the Strategic Services Unit had that if it got involved, it could get right back into this boiling pot. And at one point, Quinn wrote down that, I think he wrote down that in a hierarchy, the Ukrainian nationalists he was interviewing or working with, they were fierce and uncompromising toward anything Polish, Russian, or German in that order. So this shows kind of the tensions between Poland and Ukraine as well at the time. And Stepan Bandera and Andrei Melnik were heads of two different factions at that point in the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. They weren't actually in the contact group that was working with Strategic Services Unit, but there was a real fear that Quinn expressed that we don't really know enough about all of these groups, and we're really worried about getting involved with that ignorance as a background. So again, there was no consensus, and there were these kind of inchoate fears behind some of what the SSU was grappling with. In 1946, Quinn hired a Hungarian named Zsolt Aradi, who was an emigre in the Munich area. And he wrote him to write a consultant report that was titled The Ukrainian Nationalist Movement. And the reason for that is the SSU just wanted some basic information. Who are the actors? Who are the groups? How does, for instance, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists relate to the Ukrainian Supreme Liberation Council? As I said, the SSU did not specifically work with Bandera or Andrei Melnik, but at that point, after Aradi wrote this report, there were contacts with three key Ukrainians from this Ukrainian Supreme Liberation Council, a Catholic priest named Father Ivan Hryniok, forgive any pronunciation here, Yuri Lopatynsky, and also Mykola Lebed, who had been a founder of the Organization for Ukrainian Nationalists and also was a foreign minister of the Ukrainian Supreme Liberation Council. And Aradi identified them, and they became in this contact group between Strategic Services Unit and the Ukrainian emigre community. And a lot of, if you go through 1946-47, there were a lot of contacts, especially with those three Ukrainian emigres. Let's see. At one point, let's see if I can find it in my notes. That group was well, Aradi termed the group Referat 33, R33. And again, those three officials were kind of the key members of that contact group going forward. And as I said, Boleslav Holtzman, he was the primary representative in Munich for the Strategic Services Unit X2 unit, which was counterintelligence. And Holtzman became the main contact from April 1946 for all of these Ukrainian leaders to flesh out possibilities for gathering intelligence initially, ultimately, which became pursuing covert operations back in the East Bloc itself. And Holtzman had to review Aradi's report and other information that they were gathering to really assess Ukrainian motivations, the emigre motivations, war record, and reliability, especially against Soviet penetration, manipulation, counterintelligence work. So they really tried to assess those three key factors with these contacts. And their initial focus, long before Operation Red Sox, which again began in September of 1949, was looking just at intelligence gathering on Soviet military issues, using the emigres to help just to understand that. That was called Project Belladonna. And then the identification of Soviet agents in Western Germany, which was known as Project Lynx and then later became Trident. So those were really the two key focuses in 1946 for the Strategic Services Unit. And as I said, still with a lot of ambivalence, but they were focusing on the possibilities for intelligence gathering through this emigre community. As I talked a bit about earlier, there was a real problem when one of these second-level contacts, Miron Matvienko, he'd been chief of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalist Security Branch. He'd also been an Abwehr agent throughout the war, and ultimately they found that he was a Soviet double agent who defected to the USSR in 1951. And even before that, there was real fear of this possibility. And I looked through some records of Harry Rositsky. He at the time was, at the time when SSU was really transitioning into the CIA in 1947, he was head of the Special Projects Division, Soviet, SPD-S. And Rositsky had said, because of this fear of compromising from people like Matvienko, eventually, that he was very skeptical that these Ukrainian contacts that they would have limited value, but that they could have this real problem of being compromised. And And he was pushing more of trying to have more kind of strategic penetration at that point of the Soviet Union, rather than what he viewed these potential emigre agents as more limited tactical value. So Rositsky came out and just kind of said, we don't really want to move forward too much, was really critical to some of what Holtzman was initially gathering and spearheading. And at that point in 1947, actually, the Munich operations base where Holtzman had been had his office, it really ceased contact with the Ukrainians. Now, Mark can say probably more about this. That it struck me in reading the CIA records that in 1947, as the Strategic Service Unit was becoming the CIA, that they kind of turned over a lot of their work on this to the US Army and the State Department. This is the time, of course, when George Kennan was writing The Long Telegram and the sources of Soviet conduct on containment policy, which kind of became the intellectual backbone of the Truman Doctrine. And it struck me that the CIA or the State Department and the US Army were much more enthusiastic about this potential use of Ukrainian emigres than the Strategic Service Unit had been. And this also comes at a time when Truman, gave his speech to Congress that became kind of the initial promulgation of the Truman Doctrine. Kennan writes makes his famous publications. And what I found interesting, a real turning point there that kind of moved beyond the ambivalence of Colonel Quinn of the Strategic Services Unit, was the National Security Council, under Truman's directive in 1947, issued a report called NSC-4A. And this kind of dispatched with the ambivalence. It looked like at that point, the State Department and Army were really interested in pursuing covert psychological operations using these Ukrainian emigre population. And you don't see anymore in a lot of the records anymore that ambivalence that you saw with Colonel Quinn and even with Holtzman. And at that time, not to say that it was gone, because I was reading the CIA, the Director of Central Intelligence at that time was a man named Roscoe Hillenkotter. He was still skeptical. So he kind of still expressed some of those reservations of Quinn and others earlier. But he came under pressure from the State Department and the Army after this NSC-4A report came out. And they really wanted to pursue this possibility of using Ukrainian emigres for covert operations, which again led to ultimately Operation Red Sox. So it wasn't about intelligence gathering. It was a real move to, by 1949, dropping these emigres in by parachute to try to make contacts and not only gather intelligence and make contacts with the Ukrainian nationalist movement, the Ukrainian insurgent army, but also ultimately to undermine Soviet power in Ukraine and the Baltic states and wherever. So there was I don't know if it was because the Monroe or the Truman Doctrine had come out, but it was a real shift in security debates at that point. And there was a real key report that came out in March 1948 under the auspices of Frank Wisner, who was on the state policy planning staff, that proposed that what was known as SANAC, State Army Navy Air Force Coordinating Committee, form an ad hoc committee to take up from the Strategic Services Unit their early investigations into this and explore the use of Soviet exiles and emigres. And that all came out in a paper called SANAC 395. So this NSC-4A and SANAC 395 set the kind of the intellectual groundwork for really moving forward with what had always been an ambivalent approach by the Strategic Services Unit and Quinn. And this SANAC 395 concurred and welcomed Soviet defections and also the use of emigres in covert agency operations. Now, again, maybe we can talk about it. There was still a holdover resistance from CIA, which had direct links to the Strategic Services Unit. And there was an official named Alan McCracken, who still resisted this, kind of the way Quinn had. But the SANEC committee was really eager to push forward. I think this came from the National Security Committee meetings that came out of, the new Truman Doctrine. So at least that's what it seems to be in kind of resolving these internal debates. By 1948, 49, the CIA had replaced the Munich operations base, immediate post-war, with an Office of Special Operations. And they replaced Boleslav Holtzman with other officials to kind of really try to move forward some of these ideas of utilizing the Ukrainian emigres. And it's interesting at that point, Richard Helms, who later became the head of the CIA from 1966 to 73, and in the late 40s, he was the head of what was known as Foreign Branch M. Richard Helms, he was at a higher level already, of course, than Boleslav Holtzman, but he was quite excited about this potential. And Helms became involved in planning to actually send couriers in what was known as Operation Apostles from the Ukrainian Supreme Leadership Council back to Ukraine with radios, and who would be flown in by air and dropped into Ukraine by parachute. Now, I don't know, there's some things in the files that say Soviet air defenses and reconnaissance was so weak at that point that they didn't feel that this would be hard to do this, and that they could parachute in without, being found. Now, we know later that over 75% were almost immediately captured. But that was in the CIA files, that they felt that, what they did is I don't know where the flights took off from with the Ukrainian emigres in Operation Red Sox, but they flew out toward Turkey and then back up across the Black Sea into Ukraine. And the earliest agents were parachuted into the Lvov region, Western Ukraine. I think, which was still at that point in 1949, probably where the Ukrainian insurgent army still had a more active presence. But that was in September of 1949, the first mission went by plane and dropped 2 agents off over Lvov. Yes.
So many of them were captured right away. Was it because the flights were detected, or did they have some intelligence that this was going on?
I think the sentiment was that there was intelligence about these contacts, and that the Soviets knew they were coming. It struck me when you look at it that they had been compromised. It may be that they also were, could see, had some assessment of the planes coming in and the people parachuting, but it struck me that later on they reviewed and felt that this had been compromised, that a lot of the Soviets kind of knew they were coming. As I said, 75% were captured almost immediately, and I think only a few ever actually survived or got out again. They were also, at this point, I don't want to get, if you go into all the record of CIA operations, there was a Project Androgen, later known as Cartel, which is also to assess alliance possibilities with the Ukrainian underground movement, of which the Operation Red Sox agents were to help link up to. And so anyway, when Richard Helms started to spearhead that, he, I guess, wrote a follow-up report by 1948 that on July 26, 1949, was finally approved by a CIA official named Robert A. Schow, S-C-H-O-W, who was the assistant for special operations. And once Schow gave his approval, Operation Red Sox kind of went into active mode. So from July to, the first flight then went in September of 1949. Now, one interesting thing, this is just an aside, the CIA wrote a whole history of this operation with multiple, files, and you can find a lot of information in different areas. But the contacts with the Supreme Ukrainian Liberation Group, they helped to set up an anti-Soviet research publication operation in New York at the same time that, from what I could tell, continued until the end of the Soviet Union. And although the CIA admitted that Operation Red Sox was a great failure, that contact with the Ukraine Supreme Liberation Council really helped their research publications, and played a role to try to ultimately succeed once the Cold War ended with the fall of the Soviet Union. So there was a claim that that was the one link that led to some success, even though the covert operations had failed. One of the things I just want to say, when you look at this again, having looked in the Gulag archives for how the ethnic composition of the prison population changed over time, one of the unfortunate things with the whole CIA covert operations early in Soviet Ukraine, especially with Operation Red Sox, was it was just a complete mismatch in timing. By the time the CIA formed, by the time the first airdrops happened in September of 1949, the Ukrainian insurgent army and the underground movement was just weakening and weakening. I mean, I think it existed officially until 1956, but there again, you go through the Gulag archives, wave of Ukrainian prisons coming in by 46, 47, 48, and then it falls off into the early 50s. So you realize that, Stalin had already really begun to crush this insurgency at the very time when the CIA launched these covert operations. So the idea that they were going to link up to these insurgent groups in Ukraine, well, they were already fast fading because of the failure of the insurgency. So had it happened earlier, I don't know, the CIA admitted it was a failure. Maybe it would have had more success, but the timing was totally off. And that's one thing comes through when you overlay that and you realize that that was a mismatch of chronology. We can open it up to questions and conversation. I just think clearly when you look through, this was really one of the first, if not the first, efforts at sending emigres back into covert operations in the East Bloc. It was really one of the earliest CIA efforts in that area in its history. And as I said, the CIA published, that it was an abject failure, but they learned a lot from it. It was a complicated picture at the time. I think if you look at events in Ukraine today, the US government, the Truman Doctrine, the interests of the CIA never really changed. There was still a great interest in seeing Ukraine succeed and more possibilities for independence, of course, in the modern era. And this is just something that I think maybe, we're all watching what's unfolding in the White House lately. I've noticed certain things, especially when you reflect on the Truman Doctrine. What's really changed from that era and now, and of course within the Republican Party, I noticed this when I saw this just savage attack on the USAID agency. Over the years, the Truman, I didn't really realize this was kind of going on, but I later thought maybe it's an attack on the deep state or the foreign policy establishment. Mark can comment more on this, but there seemed to be a real ideological stance forming within the Republican Party against globalist intervention, nation building, outreach that was a big part of, you could say, the Truman Doctrine, reaching out to save democracies and protect countries from falling into the Soviet orbit. That just seems entirely to have flipped now. And I think when you look at some of the critiques against this globalism and interventions and all, from Korea to Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and now Ukraine, I just reflected on it to see, this, whether or not the president is close to Putin, there's an ideological shift happening where USAID is seen, the agency is seen as a very much a negative. Tulsi Gabbard has been appointed Director of National Intelligence, Kash Patel in the FBI. And you can start linking together that, this attack on USAID is not necessarily new. That what was different 75 years ago in the promulgation of the Truman Doctrine to help the captive nations or the free world, so to speak, has just been turned around. There's that is gone when you look at these records from today's perspective. And somehow over those years, what you could say the neoconservative legacy or whatever, to have intervention, to help countries, fight against tyranny and totalitarianism, there just seems to be this attack on nation building and intervention that's really deep seated. It goes far beyond whatever the president's relationships with Putin. And I think that would be interesting to talk about because as you look through our current situation with Ukraine, it's hard not to miss certain things when you look back at this earlier CIA activity in Soviet Ukraine in the late 1940s and to draw some parallels on just how much has changed in the larger international environment. I know that's a lot. I welcome Mark's comments and also just opening it up.
Okay, thank you very much, David. Let me just add a few words of context in thinking about, I want to focus mostly on the history rather than the dismal situation today. In terms of the context, as you noted, CIA didn't formally exist until 1947. So you have this fluid situation in which it had gone from the Office of Strategic Services plus other intelligence agencies during the war to again, variety of intelligence organizations which were seeking to gain preeminence. But it wasn't until the National Security Act of 1947 with the establishment of the CIA, but there continued to be other intelligence agencies, including under the military branches and the State Department and so forth. So some of what was going on has to be seen in that light, that there wasn't a clearly defined policy-making structure with regard to intelligence. And that probably was one of the reasons that there was this delay. And if you wanted to assist anti-communist and anti-Soviet, anti-communist insurgents in the former Soviet Union or in the emerging Soviet bloc, then you'd want to do it early while they were still had some chance. By 1949, it was very clear that the insurgent movements in Soviet Ukraine had been largely destroyed, not entirely. As you mentioned, there continued to be some insurgent activities through the mid-50s, but in terms of any effective efforts, it was gone by soon after 1945. Into 46 perhaps, but after that, it really began to peter out. You can trace this in the Ukrainian KGB archives as well as in some of the central archives in Moscow, and also in firsthand accounts by people who took part in the insurgency. In terms of in Congress, the US Congress at the time, there was a great deal of reluctance to remain involved in European affairs, including deployment of troops. And so until the outbreak of the Korean War, when that sentiment changed, there was this hope in the Congress and in many parts of US society that the United States would be able to retreat to North America again and not be involved in European affairs. So that too influenced the behavior of people in the Truman administration who had to shape policy against the backdrop of political concerns. And some of the resistance was definitely from Republican senators like Robert Taft and others in Vandenberg. But there also were numerous people within the Democratic Party as well who were reluctant to do that, to be heavily involved, to have a national security policy that would affect much of Europe. So all of that influenced US policy toward the emerging Soviet bloc. There were also CIA attempts to assist anti-communist insurgents in Albania. This was done in conjunction with the British MI6. And again, it turned out to be a complete failure. In this case, in the case of Albania, every agent turned out to have been compromised. And so the reason that so many were arrested or wiped out after they tried to get in is that there was knowledge. That's very evident from the Ukrainian KGB archive that they did know about operations that were going on and took steps to detain any people who wanted or who tried to come in. They wanted them to come in so then they could capture them and interrogate them. But they also had knowledge of what was going on and were able essentially to uproot any effort, especially one that was undertaken as late as 1949. Very quickly, I should add, though, within the politics of the United States, I mean, there was no one who more ardently pursued covert operations using the CIA than Dwight Eisenhower for the Republicans. So it didn't remain, the Republican Party through the end of the Cold War was certainly not against covert operations, quite the opposite. And it turned out, there was a great deal of bipartisan effort or support for such operations. There were exceptions, but for the most part, there wasn't a great deal of resistance to it. The problem was that most of the efforts failed. There were some successes, as with Guatemala, Iran, Chile, and a few others, but many of the operations did not prove successful. To its credit, the CIA has declassified, after a great deal of reluctance, has declassified some of the relevant materials by which these operations can be judged. And in particular, Operation Red Sox and others, you can easily find these. They've been digitized and they're downloadable as PDF files, and Belladonna too. Let me also just one thing. George Kennan, even though he is usually associated with containment, he actually, at the time he had his greatest influence, which was only brief when he was head of the State Department's policy planning staff. After that, he basically, even when he was U.S. ambassador during the Kennedy administration, he had very little influence after that. But still, during the time he did have his greatest influence, including when he was writing some of the important documents you mentioned. He actually was strongly in favor of a rollback policy, not containment, but rollback. He was the chief author of PRM 10, the Presidential Review Memorandum 10, that laid out a strategy of sabotage, demolition, support of armed insurgents and the like in the former Soviet bloc. And the odd thing is the CIA, which had been newly created at that point, was very reluctant to pursue such a strategy. It thought that, there weren't many prospects of success. And Kennan braided some of the intelligence officials and told them that if they didn't want to do it, they should make way for the State Department to take over. So it's ironic that someone who did pursue a strategy of containment or outline that strategy was actually behind the scenes highly supportive of a much more aggressive rollback policy than the CIA actually ended up pursuing, at least in those early years. So let me just, with regard to the present, I have no words for it. And I don't think you can really, the Truman Doctrine applied mostly to Greece and Turkey and other insurgents. It really didn't apply to Ukraine per se. To the former Soviet Union. That was separate. I mean, maybe it was implicit, but in any case, today's situation, I don't think you can learn that much from looking back at these periods, at the early years of U.S. policy towards Soviet Ukraine, except to say that you can rationalize, I'm sure that Putin has cited some of these operations to claim that, the United States is trying to undermine Russia by being in Ukraine, but it's just propaganda rhetoric, and I would avoid any effort to look back from the perspective of those, to look at today's situation from the perspective of what happened then. So,
Mark, I have just one really quick question. For Eisenhower, how much did the U2 program change his view on covert operations or the need for operations prior to U2?
well, again, there were various reasons for covert operations, one of which was to obtain information. As you mentioned, the Soviet Union was an extremely closed society, and that's why there was this effort. Massive interview projects that went on, including one here at Harvard, the Harvard Project on the Soviet Social System, all of the records of which are now accessible, and the many online too. But the Soviet Union was so closed that part of the reason for covert operations was not to undermine Soviet or communist power, but simply to obtain information. And there were a lot of these interview programs, sometimes with groups that you wouldn't even think of, like the children of Spanish communists who had been sent to the Soviet Union and during the Spanish Civil War. They grew up there, and then many of them returned in 1956. And so the CIA had a program with the support of the Spanish government to interview a lot of these people who've grown up. They'd been in the Soviet Union for close to or about 20 years, and some of them had worked in the military establishment, in the defense industries and the like. And so they could provide unique information about some of the most secretive parts of Soviet society. There were programs like that really paid off. And the same with the Harvard Project. There were others that were undertaken and provided mostly false information and not very helpful information. So the advent of the U-2, which was a reconnaissance plane that allowed for the detection of various activities in the Soviet Union, diminished, it didn't remove, but it certainly diminished the need for the type of intelligence you could get from such people. But in terms of supporting anti-communist insurgencies in the Soviet Union, that stopped, pretty much after the manifest failure of the efforts to support Ukrainian, not just Ukrainians either. There were also efforts in the Baltic states, but again, all turned out to be failures. And so it was something that was sobering for CIA and US policymakers with regard to the former Soviet Union, but elsewhere it certainly continued to be pursued.
What was the purpose of Red Sox operation? What was the goal, the end game?
I'll let David.
Well, I mean, if you look at the CIA records or reflection on it, official CIA history of all the files now declassified, it seems that it's when they went from an earlier intelligence gathering on the Soviet military and Soviet agents in Western Europe to covert psychological operations with Operation Red Sox, parachuting behind or into the East Bloc itself. And you can read that, part of it was to, gather intelligence on the ground there, but also to link up with, nationalist underground and insurgent movements to help potentially, lead nationalist rebellions against Soviet power. So that's a stated objective in the CIA history, that they did think that aside from intelligence gathering, that was potentially a result of the covert operations.
I see. So
Not that, like Mark said, the timeline was off. That really never had a possibility, but the CIA talks about it, that had been a goal.
So they were parachuted in the Western Ukraine, were they?
Well, Lvov, yeah, initially, and then, yeah, mostly, because I think that's where the remaining insurgent army.
The Western borderlands.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I should note that there were some of the emigre groups, because there were still a lot of Soviet citizens that had not returned to the Soviet Union, despite the return that happened after the war, some voluntary, some who were forced to return. But there remained a lot of Soviet citizens outside. They tended to provide information to Western policymakers that sometimes turned out to be wholly unrealistic in terms of their hopes that Soviet power could be undermined. And that was part of the problem with Operation Red Sox, is they were listening to people who sincerely believed, I think, what they were saying, but their information turned out to be false, or at least wildly hopeful, over optimistic. And there's a very good book that came out quite recently by Benjamin Tromley, who was here at the Davis Center, and he produced a book that looked at some of these what they call themselves anti-Bolshevik movements that operated in Soviet Union at that time. And they did, I mean, they were genuinely committed. They weren't, how should I put it? They weren't false people just seeking to gain support. They did believe in their cause, but the cause proved to be unachievable. But please.
I would imagine that the population of the DP camp was not homogeneous. I could see that there'd be a Jewish population that fled both the Nazis and some of their neighbors in Ukraine, who might be rather pro-Russian. The thought now, because of whether that's where those double agents came from. And then there would be some nationalists who were escaping the Russians. So do you have any insight?
That's a great question. I mean, I think that was all true. This was a broad 2.3 million were apparently in Germany alone of displaced persons, but there was a broad population of variety of ethnic and political persuasions. One thing I came across, and maybe Mark can talk about it, the Strategic Services Unit had a sense that there might be, I think, up to 700,000 Russians, I guess ethnic Russians, who were also, I don't know how many of them exactly were in Western Europe after the war, but that they could be, that they were inherently or potentially anti-communist. Almost like, it struck me in reading about it, as almost like, these are also a form of white, the white movement in the Bolshevik, in the revolutionary period. It was very naive, but I saw it written that, we could maybe tap these Russian nationalists who are anti-communist, who might then go back and help undermine Soviet power. And I was a little bit surprised to see that. And the number, I don't know if it was 700,000, but there was an attempt to flesh that out. Was there potential of that? But you're right, the variety of ethnic groups and political perspectives.
If you look just at Ukrainians, there would be that same, there could be a division of
right
types. And are the ones who
I think, by the way, that's why Quinn said, we just don't know enough to know who's trustworthy or who could be compromised. And you could just tell they were so worried about that issue.
what was the ones who chose to be double agents?
Well, I don't.
Ukrainians.
Yeah, right. One had been he had been a founding member of the organization Ukrainian Nationalists. But then in the German occupation, he worked for the Abwehr, and then he was clearly working for the Soviets. So
Opportunities.
Yeah, I mean, opportunism was a big problem. But again, Mark might be able to say, there seemed constantly, when you read that, there's just a fear of not knowing who's who.
I mean, of the Soviet citizens in the displaced persons camps or elsewhere, who many ardently did not want to return to the Soviet Union with good reason. Soviet Union was a horrible place to live in. They had been there all through the rampant loss of life during dekulakization and collectivization, dekulakization, the great purges, the great terror. They were fleeing a country that was just a murderous dictatorship. So it's understandable that they didn't want to return. On the other hand, there were a considerable number who were ambivalent about it and were potentially susceptible to being turned. And Soviet, the NKVD and its successor agencies had a detailed effort or a meticulous effort to try to recruit some of those people. So even outside the Soviet Union. So there was always that potential, as David mentioned, for people to become untrustworthy, even if they didn't initially start that way. Through blackmail, through many of them had relatives back in the Soviet Union and through other needs. Please.
Hi, my name is Martin. I'm a retired Army officer. My question is specific to what I think Professor Kramer was referring to Operation Ajax. So to, if you will, reinstall the Shah in Iran. And I read a book recently titled The Last Shah. I'm not rendering an opinion on the book, but the author's consensus was that the politics of the time in Iran made Mossadegh's position untenable, and suggesting that it was not the CIA operation that led to the reimposition, if you want to call it that, of the Shah. It was just domestic politics. And so my question is, to that question, do you believe that the Operation Ajax was instrumental in bringing the Shah back into power, if you want to put it that way, or was it domestic politics or somewhere in between?
This wasn't really the topic of David's presentation, but I can comment on it quickly. Almost all of the CIA operations that succeeded usually would have occurred even without CIA participation. That was certainly the case in Chile in September 1973. It was unquestionable after 3 years of gross mismanagement of Salvador Allende's government and the far left shift of his government that the Chilean military would have stepped in, even if the CIA hadn't supported it. Going back to Iran in 1953, the same basic thing was true, although certainly the US CIA and British support for the coup helped it. But oddly enough, some of the most ardent supporters of the coup were the Ayatollahs, including Ayatollah Khomeini, who were, didn't like it that Mossadegh, who was secular, was marginalizing them. And so they turned out to be some of the strongest supporters of the coup, even though you would never know that from listening to the propaganda of Iran's government over the last 46 years. But so in any case, usually if there was no instance that I can think of in which the CIA had a successful operation occurred in which it wouldn't have happened anyway. But that's not to say that the support for it was unimportant. Numerous instances it was.
What about the involvement of British secret intelligence service in terms of Red Sox? Because I know in the Baltic states they played a great role
Right.
in other operations.
Yeah, I did come across some of that. I probably would defer to Mark, who's done more research on this era, but
the British were definitely, many of these efforts were, even though both countries were, how should I put it, worried about that there would be traitors in the midst. I mean, many of them hadn't yet come to light, but the Cambridge Five and the like. But still, there were concerns about that. But many of the operations were undertaken.
And Mark, maybe you could comment. I did come across, this was in the CIA files, and I don't know if it's possible or true, but there was some question that Operation Red Sox failed partly because of Kim Philby.
Oh.
That was definitely the case with the Albanian operation, as Philby betrayed the entire thing. In the case of Ukraine, some of it was Philby, but there were other. Donald McLean, I think, was also one of those who divulge the intelligence about. So that's part of the reason that the Ukrainian KGB had, or what was then the NKVD, or Ministry of State Security, knew about what was going on, and so they were able to take countermeasures. But it wasn't just, it wasn't just the Western spies. It was definitely also in the displaced persons camps and elsewhere. They were able to hear rumors and the like, and so many of those made their way back to the Soviet and KVD.
Mark, can you give example of a successful CIA covert operation on the territory of the former Soviet Union? Successful.
I don't think there was one, so I
That's what
can't
I think.
really give an example. You know, as I say, the CIA did have numerous successes, but it liked to, the agency liked to give this impression that it was omnipotent and that it could overthrow governments at will. I mean, it did, it had a fairly significant covert operations directorate, but it was never omnipotent. Most of the efforts either weren't undertaken because they knew they would fail or they failed. The successors, which I've mentioned some of those, were relatively uncommon. And usually they built on something that was going to happen anyway.
It's like in El Salvador.
As in Iran or Chile in 1973, I think is the clearest example when even if the CIA had done nothing, look who would have happened. It's not to say that CIA support for it was unimportant, but it clearly was not, it wasn't a prerequisite.
Is this also the case for Yugoslavia for 48? The split with Stalin and so on?
But I mean, it's an interesting, sorry,
Yeah.
I'm speaking more than David, but 1948 proved to be an interesting case of where the United States did have significant intelligence sharing with Tito's government, from 1950 or 51 on, and it was selling weapons to Yugoslavia too. So the break, initially 1948 was a little early because there was still concern that maybe the split wasn't real or that there would be a rapprochement between the two. But as it became clear that there was going to be a permanent rift between them, both the United States and Britain took advantage of that. It didn't last because after Stalin's death, basically Yugoslavia began moving away from that. But it even, there was even the prospect of admitting Yugoslavia into NATO. Tito was reluctant to entertain that notion, but there were people in his government who actually wanted to pursue it. There's a good book that came out in the Covert Studies book series on that by a couple of former Yugoslav, or I think from the former Yugoslav archives. They had access to all the materials, and so Yugoslavia is a case in which there was an opportunity to exploit vulnerability of the Soviet Union, and they did make an effort to do it. So that was clearly a success, but not on Soviet territory.
Bill, was he a CIA agent?
No, he certainly was of great interest. And the CIA did help finance the publication of the new class, his book, the new class. The English translation, I should say, because I think the British funded the German translation, if I'm not mistaken. And there were certainly efforts to, this another important, this was a success. Soviet Union had a secret book distribution program within the Soviet Union. And so this was to bring in books like Solzhenitsyn and other.
I mean, white pass, белый pass.
And so that was successful, but it was mostly what you mentioned, David, psychological warfare. It wasn't an attempt to aid armed insurgents. That pretty much was abandoned after the 50s, certainly after 1956. Other question?
Is there any logic behind the name of the Red Sox? Am I missing something there, or?
Yeah, I couldn't.
They were native Bostonians.
Well, it was connected to Operation Redbird was kind of a parallel approach, I think, with the Baltics largely. But I don't know. Yeah, I did read. It was interesting with like the cryptonyms and other things in CIA history.
Redbirds are the name of the team in Orleans, if I'm not.
Right,
mistaken.
Redbirds.
Right.
Right. But that sometimes, you know, like even in World War II, Operation Jedburgh, a lot of people said, what's that? You know, it really was kind of a concoction, although there's something related to Jedburgh in Scotland that they retrospectively, you know, gave it a connection. But yeah, I don't know. You could probably say how the CIA came to name certain operations out, you know, certain ways or.
I'm gonna ask you a question instead.
Okay.
It's a little surprising to me, especially in light of this history that you've laid out. Thank you so much. It's a great presentation. I'm surprised that Putin doesn't really talk about this at all. I mean, he certainly has a basis for doing so. It's a great talking point.
Well, the only thing though, you can see a lot of times when Putin speaks, he talks about Banderites and Nazis.
He certainly
He's
does.
going right back to this whole era.
To be sure.
You know, so.
To be sure, but specifically with respect to nefarious American
Right.
involvement, do you notice that yourself? And if
Yeah.
so, do you have a hypothesis of why?
I don't really know what, maybe Mark would have a good.
Yeah, Martin.
Again, you know, he has raised it on a few occasions, and certainly Sergei Narishkin has, the head of the Foreign Intelligence Service, and but not, you know, again, as David mentioned, they focus mostly on Ukrainian World War II experience with them. But Bandera, I should add, you know, as David mentioned, there were these two groups of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. One with Bandera, the other with Melnik and Andrei Melnik, who you know, Bandera spent most of the war in a prison camp, and so you know, a great deal of that too was wildly exaggerated for propaganda reasons. Even though again these armed insurgent groups, especially Ukrainian People's Army, committed atrocities, especially against Poles and Jews. So it's not to say that they were innocent or noble fighters, but they, you know, their main aim, though, even though they committed those atrocities, was to fight for independence, and that's what I think the reason that they are so often singled out, because Putin doesn't denounce their you know, committing of atrocities against Jews or Poles. He talks about how they fought against the Soviet army.
One thing you can come across is the CIA took some credit for preventing Bandera from being captured by the Soviets. They really wanted him.
Or Ukrainian insurgent army. Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
But that was one that came up.
So your point about the timing is, it was in 46 already that Churchill said an iron wall is falling.
Yeah.
We needed to know what was going on.
Yeah.
It's common knowledge.
Well, as I say, you know, one of the striking things in looking back at some of the U.S. intelligence records was just how little was known about the Soviet Union, even basic information. That's why anything that would illuminate what was going on, the sentiment of the Soviet population, the extent to which there were vulnerabilities that could be pursued, you know, that was just ardently pursued. But the problem was that it remained extremely closed, at least until the death of Stalin, and in many respects for years after.
Of course, if you send correspondents like Walter Duranty, of course, you're going to know close to zero. The guy, you know,
Minus, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
Right, but there was no, you know.
Walter Duranty contributed, you know, negative. That is, he lessened the knowledge of people. So because it was also phony, and even though Duranty was not a communist, and he apparently was not.
Son of a bitch, yeah.
Yeah, no, he's just an awful person. For anyone who wants. Duranty was the New York Times correspondent who was in Soviet Union in the 1930s and wrote about the famine in Ukraine, about how there wasn't a famine, even though there were other courageous journalists like Gareth Jones of the British journalist who wrote extensively about.
And he got Pulitzer for that report.
Durante did, yeah. Durante did. It's a very good report that was done by the late Mark von Hagen on Durante's time in the Soviet Union. And he recommended that the Pulitzer Prize be rescinded, but it wasn't. So other questions? We still have about 1 minute, so.
It's a little bit philosophical question, but looking at the kinds of research that you're doing and in the archives and all this and sort of historical lessons learned, I'm imagining myself as a mid-career CIA officer tasked with planning that next mission. Do I have access to any of this information? I've only got 24 hours a day and I've got to sleep at least a few of them. Do I have access to this kind of level of information that can inform my planning that next mission?
At the time, you mean in the moment?
In the moment.
Well, I mean, the CIA had a library, and I don't know what what's the.
I mean, there
What was
was a
available.
great deal of the various planning boards and others that put in information, usually did their best to understand what was going on, but it's inherent, especially during the Stalin era, it was inherently a very difficult thing. But again, the CIA has generally been extremely reluctant to declassify files, anything pertaining to operational matters, that is clandestine operations. And the Freedom of Information Act exempts the operations director of the CIA. So it's been very difficult to get files. However, over the last 10 years or so, there's been a gradual declassification of records pertaining to specific operations, like the Iran, the 1953 overthrow of Mossadegh in Iran, or with regard to Guatemala in 1954, or with regard to Chile in 1973. So you can actually find a lot of files now about those, and they do show that they put in a great deal of effort. It wasn't just undertaken, in a slapdash manner. So I guess my answer to your question is, if you get into that business and take it seriously, you do try your best to accomplish your goal. But, okay, we need to end. Sorry, I'm just noticing the clock. So let me thank David very much. Let me thank everyone for coming. Good to have you back, David.
Yeah, thank you.